This is Kathleen Dudley with the workshop Women's Worth, and this is part 2 of Going Home. What we find is that whatever revives balance is essential. That is home. So when we are denied this through our culture, socially, through our psyche, we learn to leap over the gate or dig under the fence anyway. And we can become chronically ill when we need time alone to go home. That unexpected external shock to our system that situates a disease in our body, known through German New Medicine, as something that strikes us simultaneously in the mind, in the psyche, and in the physical body. When we are shocked away from our true nature, our true being, from our home. We might even pick a fight with a mate, a husband, a friend, to assert our psychic needs. And we'll say, well, I'm leaving, or I don't love you any longer. All of these very defensive statures that have to do with protecting ourselves from the very essence of deprivation, of not being home. It is fundamentally, foundationally crucial that we find home, that we go home, that we have an access to home. If a woman has to fight for what is rightfully hers, she feels justified. She feels absolutely vindicated in her desire to go home, to fight for what is a proper instinctive response to being hindered. However, what we are not taught, what we have lost over the years of being removed from this rightful process, this coming of age process, is that this should be an internal fight, not an external fight. So we say to ourselves, I am going, then go. The Inuits say, woman carves a life for herself. And that is done through symbols and creativity and through physical and emotional circumstances. Because without that, we actually are starving our soul. Solitude. Women need solitude in order to find again the true essence of themselves. Anne Moreau Lindbergh, in The Gift from the Sea, was quoted in this last statement. Women need solitude in order to find again the true essence of themselves. In order to access and converse with the wild feminine, a woman must temporarily leave the world and inhabit a state of aloneness in the oldest sense of the word. Alone means all one. The goal of solitude is to be all one. We're used to heat, fatigue, and to prevent weariness. This is a way of listening to the inner self, to solicit advice and guidance, otherwise impossible to hear in the dim of daily life. Solitude or stillness. This is the cure for the frazzled state so common to modern women. Quote, when we invite solitude, we invite a conversation between ourselves and the wild soul that comes near to the shore. We do this to be near our wild and soulful nature and to ask questions and for the soul to advise. This is from the book women who run with the wolves. We call up to the soul. This is our intuition in meditation, in running, in yoga, in drumming, singing, writing, painting, playing music, contemplation, ritual, being still. All call up the soul from its dwelling place. And how is this done? This is done by tuning out distractions, talking to oneself, becoming lost in thought, daydreaming, staring out into space. She who does not seek, demand, denies her birthright. This is the soul's path. There's a quote. The worth of a cabbage depends upon the way it fulfills a promise to the seed. And is that not true to a woman? It is communing with the soul that causes us to glow brightly with spirit, willing to assert our talents. It is that brief, even momentary, but intentional union that supports us to live out our inner lives, so that instead of burying them in the self-inversion of shame, fear, or reprisal of attack, lethargy, complacency, or other limiting reasonings and excuses, we let our inner lives wave, flare, blaze on the outside for all to see, embracing our dual nature. And this is certainly the message that comes from the myth, the red shoes, in women who run with the wolves. The physical body. Most of women's depressions are caused by severely restricted soul life, where creativity is restricted or forbidden. Women still deprived today of talents through cultural restrictions and punishment of her natural and wildish instincts. If a woman surrenders her power, her psyche becomes a wisp of her former wildish self. When we dry out, life is diminished. We see this in the myth, the seal skin, the soul skin, the spiritual, emotional, and mental shriveling. Developing a spiritual life means letting go of self. The determination to make things happen how you want. It is about believing you don't have all the answers. It is letting go of self-will, being willing to hold still, be open, and waiting for guidance for yourself. Developing a spiritual life is learning to let go of fear and despair and replace with positive thoughts and statements about your life. Developing a spiritual life is not about faith, but willingness. It requires a belief in a higher power. Developing a spiritual life calms you, helps change your perspective from being a victim to being uplifted. It is a source of strength in a crisis. Developing a spiritual life frees you from the overwhelming responsibility of fixing everything, controlling the man in your life, and preventing disaster. developing a spiritual life because you have access to spiritual nourishment. Your life and your happiness come to be more under your own control and less vulnerable to the actions of others. For the starving soul, the solution is to return home, as well stated in The Women Who Run for the Wolves. Again, the answer is through creative measures and endeavors, poetry, sitting by a river, an ocean, daydreaming, painting, reading, accessing your creative capacities. Home is a place we remember of calm, peaceful silence, where a woman feels at one piece, where a thought or a feeling can be sustained instead of being interrupted or torn away from us because something else is demanding our time and attention. We lose ourselves into the wild gradually. We regain our last injured instinct that is possible when we watch and listen. A return to ourself wakes us up when we pay attention and stop being naive, when we take life in our hands. We relearn the deep feminine instincts through shining light on how they got to be that way. Quote, "He who cannot howl cannot find his pack," said Charles Simic. He who cannot howl will not find his pack. So home, finding home, is the pristine instinctual life that is balance. Going home will be done when it is time, in balance, in the cycle. How to balance going home with daily lives? We must give the same value as to the rest of one's daily activities and not put it off as if it is expendable. Without going home, a woman becomes ill, depressed, lackluster. Quest for your true self cries from the depth of your being. Your archetypes hold the imprint of that true self, your wild woman, fed by your connection to nature and your creativity. None of us begins life knowing who we are or why we are the way we are. We have to search deeply for that knowledge. We have to ask the very questions, who am I? How can I be more fulfilled? What is my purpose? What is the nature of my inner power? Well, it's a personal journey, a quest to find your inner self, a longing to be embraced without hesitation or fear. Your archetypes hold the imprint of that true self. Self-esteem. We are not born with self-esteem. We must create, evolve. The level of self-esteem directs everything we do in life and how, says Carolyn Mace. It's the inner sense of power and personal identity. Without it, we would not be able to hear our intuitive guidance. We couldn't trust the intellectual in ourselves as it engages new ideas. Self-esteem comes to us through the form of imagery in our dreams and daydreams. It is otherwise known as self-empowerment. Sacred contracts, which govern your relationship to your personal power, to spiritual power, and are expressed through every aspect of your life. We are born with life assignments and are governed by our archetypal patterns called sacred contracts. So we must ask ourselves, what is our sacred contract? And when did we first begin our quest for inner knowledge? And also, when did we first begin our return to our feminine, to connect with our wild woman, our inner divine goddess, our intuitive knowing, the divine within? And we must ask ourselves, what does consciousness mean to you? Because consciousness is the way out of the box, the way out of the agony of the torture, the agony of the not knowing, the agony of not knowing home. And then we must ask ourselves, what is our dream? Laws of being, never compromise yourself. Selfishness is, quote, he who carries his brother to bed is never free of pressures. And another, if you do not concern yourself with being a vital force, you cannot serve the world in which you live. You become a burden. Unquote, David Seabury, in The Art of Being Selfish. The basic law of being is never compromise yourself. She who does not seek, demand, denies her birthright. He says, the worth of a cabbage depends on the way it fulfills a promise to the seed. And quote, the duty to others is achieved only by being what one can become as radiantly as possible. Unquote. The condemnation of self and condemnation of God are one and the same. And quote, cause of failure. One either doesn't compromise enough or else too much. David Seabury. The art of overcoming obstacles is not a matter of morals, but of character and consistency. We conquer trouble when we discover what we are like and decide to follow a way of life that matches our nature, in alignment with our archetypes, our integrity. What does integrity mean to you? And one must ask, are you in line with your integrity? Do you know what your values are? All of these must be asked and answered because they are fundamental to our sovereignty, to our freedom. Discipline. David Seabury said, life is a principle of order, a creative process, no deviation from basic law, obedience to cosmic law. We must have a belief, because if we don't follow any advice until our heart and mind are one, and that you know the counsel is wise. Discipline requires a focus, and it requires understanding the purpose of the focus. I went to a Buddhist retreat, a silent Buddhist retreat, realizing that I was going to take it seriously. And in taking it seriously, understood the discipline that I needed to incorporate. It was a very successful 2 weeks. Archetypes and myths. Carolyn Mace, medical intuitive, speaks about disappointments and heartaches and life crises that are the result of our life plans, which are difficult to heal, not just because of whatever logical messes result, but also because our myths are shattered. Sometimes, she says, it is easier to recover from a physical crisis than from a myth crisis if you don't even realize yours is one. An unacknowledged myth crisis can be the seed of lifelong depression and even a terminal illness. Oftentimes, what we need to heal is a new, more appropriate myth that gives us a reason to live. And what keeps us floundering without purpose beyond our procreative means? What gets in our way? In the attachment theory book, a lack of selfishness and patriarchy can often be a roadblock. Being indulged or spoiled as a child, raised as girls without a purpose other than procreation, as raised as dolls. What else gets in the way? By not accepting that our wounds, our pain, the dominance by others are our own inner struggle to heal. It's also about believing that we cannot change our own neurosis from our early wounds. Therefore, we compromise ourselves by the sheer fact that we believe our ego. What gets in the way? The story of the ugly duckling, of not fitting in and believing and being and feeling, being the outcast. And in the myth, Bluebird Beard, about being naive, or Red Shoes, being too nice and not standing in our own truth. We are wounded in that manner. And Manawi, the myth of recognizing our dual nature, embracing our wild woman, and claiming our inner self. And in the sealskin, soul skin myth, through our forgetting to go home, we stay away too long. We dry out, we become brittle, we lose our light and nearly lose ourselves. The spirit child takes us back to ourself, where we unite with our soul, our wild woman, and we become moist again and verdant. If we use our archetypes, we're learning more about who we are, our dualism, our wild woman nature, our feminine nature, our wounding. We can go home again. We use our archetypes through stories, mythology, psychology, and divination. It gives us an access to our intuition. There was a quote, if you want your children to grow up being intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to become even more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. This all requires self-love. It requires looking into our soulful eyes and making it a habit. It takes 30 days to change a neurological pathway, an old behavioral pathway that, whether it's PTSD or a depressive comment or statement that we perpetrate upon ourselves over and over again. So we use that knowledge of our brain, and we use the mirror to look into those soulful eyes to see within our soul the spark, the beauty, the majesty within, the divine wild woman, the divine goddess. We look within every day and we embrace ourselves and we say to ourselves, I love you, until we become so impassioned that our day begins with looking into our eyes and embracing ourselves with self-love. It is at that moment that we surrender and we fully take in that we never compromise ourselves. The wild woman, the soul woman, her force can be felt through the feminine powers of insight, passion, and connections to the wild nature. It is through the love for and caring for our own natural cycles and seasons that we protect our lives from being dragged into someone else's hunger. It's through going home, coming to ourselves, coming to our inner divine core.